Ailey, a new documentary about the legendary dancer, director, and choreographer Alvin Ailey, is a poetic, somewhat elusive portrait of the artist, but that's beside the point. The rare performances of his most famous works told me everything I needed to know and left me breathless. Ailey reconstructs the vibrancy and emotion of Alvin Ailey's choreography, first by taking us inside the rehearsal room for the creation of a new dance, celebrating the 60th anniversary of the company, called Lazarus, a theme of resurrection meant to channel the blood memories of Alvin Ailey through the dancers of his company. Ailey often spoke of wanting his dances to channel blood memories, meaning the collective memories of parents and ancestors, and then through these dances, spotlight the oppression and resilience of being Black in America. The director, Jamila Wignot, and the editor, Anuka Leah, weave the creation of this new dance piece celebrating Ailey's life with Dust Bowl era black and white footage, audio interviews with Ailey, as well as interviews with his colleagues to reveal the creative spirit that fueled his artistic achievements. I say creative spirit versus the man behind the legend because this documentary is less focused on the man behind the legend and his personal life, and more focused on how he translated his emotional life to the stage. The editor of the film told Filmmaker magazine that in the years leading up to his death, Mr. Ailey recorded details of his life in a series of audio interviews for his biographer. In these tapes, Alvin Ailey is more relaxed and more vulnerable than in his numerous public interviews. Ailey was gay and intensely private due to the extreme homophobia of the time. I dug a little deeper, as the film does not address this, but his dance company was under constant scrutiny by the Department of State, and the FBI threatened his company with bankruptcy if he showed any signs of effeminate or homosexual behavior while on tour. It's no surprise he hid, because otherwise the government would likely have taken away his dance company, and that's what had become his only means of expression. One long-term member of the dance company, Masazumi Chaya, recalls being invited only once to Ailey's home in 15 years. Very few people got to know Alvin Ailey intimately. His work was his life, but in these recordings with his biographer, he lets his guard down somewhat. Ailey remembers as a child being glued to his mother's hip, sloshing through the terrain, branches slashing against a child's body, going from one place to another, looking for a place to be. My mother working off the fields I used to pick cotton, he says. The director and the editor used these audio interviews to guide the visual approach to the story. The archival footage of the era allows us to live in Ailey's point of view, and the filmmaker's approach works very well considering their very secretive subject. We know Alvin Ailey's early days were horribly difficult. He was born in Texas in 1931. He was raised by a single mother with little money during a time in which there was no opportunity for Black women. Wignot utilizes black and white archival footage from Texas to evoke what his childhood may have looked like. Combined with Ailey's audio interviews, the resulting effect comes close to emulating the visual language of his choreography. When Ailey speaks of almost drowning as a child and being saved by his best friend Chauncey, with whom he also has his first sexual experience, the creative license the filmmakers take with this black and white footage allows us to feel as if we've sort of glimpsed inside these moments of his youth. Ailey and his mother moved to Los Angeles when he was 12, and there he discovered Katherine Dunham, the Black dancer and choreographer. Her company ultimately inspired Ailey's fusion of spiritual, gospel, and blues that would become his trademark, a blend of modern dance that speaks to the Black experience. Ailey moves to New York in 1954 at the age of 23. We ever so briefly hear he studies with Martha Graham, and he studies with the modernist Lester Horton. And then the film leapfrogs to his most famous, groundbreaking, and mythological ballet, Revelations, his 1960 exploration of the Black experience. We see spectacular footage from its original performance and get a sense of how audiences responded to his masterpiece. But we do not ever learn how the Alvin Ailey American Dance Theater got off the ground, how he supported himself, but I'm fine with that. They would have needed to insert a narrator, which may have destroyed the poetry they were creating. They wanted Ailey to tell his story as much as possible, so I appreciate the brevity and creative spirit focus of this documentary. At an hour and 20 minutes, it is not an exhaustive, mind-numbing journey on the scale of Ken Burns. So instead of doing a by-the-numbers documentary, the filmmakers bring the results of Ailey's creative spirit to the foreground, and they create a joyful experience bound with sorrow. This narrowed focus reveals as much for me about Ailey than if I'd watched a 13-hour 4-part series. Ailey's choreography, much like Tennessee Williams' poetic lyricism, reveals his story to us, and thankfully we don't need all the minute details of his daily life. The most amazing, most joyous aspect of the film are the dance sequences. The combination of these pieces beautifully illustrate his drive, obsession, and need to express through dance what he could not speak of. As Cicely Tyson says at the Kennedy Center Honors, Alvin Ailey is Black, and he's universal. After the sudden death of his friend, the choreographer and dancer Joyce Trisler, Ailey says he couldn't grieve until he had choreographed Memoria, a dance of loneliness and jubilation in her honor. Ailey often spoke of dark, deep things, beautiful things inside me that I'd always been trying to get out. Dance allowed Ailey an outlet in which to communicate with the world. I do wish we'd been able to learn more about Ailey's private life. Can I suggest part 2? I want to know how he navigated as a homosexual during the 1950s and 1960s. We very briefly learn he brought a gorgeous young man from France named Abdullah to live with him in New York City in the 70s at the height of his fame. Ailey says Abdullah was so beautiful men approached him on the street, which awakened jealousy. Then one night after a party, Abdullah disappeared or abandoned him, never to return again. This is really the only nugget we get about Ailey's romantic life, and I definitely wanted to know more. What happened to Abdullah? But this is not that documentary. I'll find a biography. If you have any suggestions, I'd love to hear them in the comments section. Ailey is a documentary focused on his creative spirit. We don't learn how fame affected Ailey or how the white cultural mainstream used him. We're told he suffers a mental breakdown in the 1980s, but the information about his manic depressive diagnosis is vague. His mental health was fragile towards the end of his life, most likely due to his suffering from AIDS. Before his death, he passed on his company to Judith Jameson, who says of him, "Alvin breathed in and never breathed out. We are his breath out," she continues. So that's what we're floating on. That's what we're living on. By focusing primarily on his creative spirit, his breath in, the filmmakers wash over the perversion of seeing a gay Black man with HIV receive an award from President Ronald Reagan, who ignored the HIV/AIDS epidemic. Ronald Reagan did not utter the name of the disease until 1985, when it had already killed 24,000 people, mostly gay and bisexual men. And it wasn't until 1987 when Reagan would actually speak on the subject. Ailey died from AIDS complications in 1989. But, per his wishes, Dr. Alvin Ailey, his physician, attributed his death to terminal blood dyscrasia, a rare disorder that affects the bone marrow and red blood cells. So there's a lot left to explore. But do we need these details? Ailey, the documentary, does a mighty fine job of exploring his life through his choreography. The interviews with and memories of his creative team are priceless and reveal just how much they cared about him and he them. Bill T. Jones, the choreographer who collaborated with Ailey, offers the most caustic analysis. One's gift, one's genius, separates oneself from one's colleagues. And he guessed, based on his intuition and experience, that Ailey suffered from, and I quote, a self-loathing that comes from feeling unworthy of success. There's more with Bill T. Jones and Judith Jamison that you do not want to miss. I highly recommend Ailey, which is ultimately a celebration of his creative spirit, which ushered itself forth whenever he was in emotional upheaval. Towards the end of the film, I feared we would end on a sorrowful note. I'm happy to report we do not. Nothing but tears of joy for Ailey. See it in a theater for the full immersive experience. I laughed, I cried, and was profoundly moved. Ailey, the documentary, captured for me some of the emotions his audiences must have felt upon seeing his work for the very first time. Wow. Thank you, Mr. Ailey. Thank y'all for watching, and until next time, always remember, living well.